Hello, everybody. Welcome or welcome back to another episode of the Crossroads. I am your host, Rashida Green, and this is the show for and about environmental justice and those who fight the fight with skin as melanated as the days are long. Knowledge is power. And we are breaking down these stereotypes, one episode at a time in here. Hello, I am back. We are back to celebrate and continue this season. So that is always a celebration. Anytime I can pry myself away from work, TV, reading and writing, I love to celebrate it. So let's celebrate. And if you've been making pivots and making sacrifices for your dreams, celebrate that. Okay. So this episode is actually a continuation of the previous episode in which I talked about the movie, The Hills Have Eyes. So this is The Hills Have Eyes Part 2. And as I mentioned, we are focusing on the Marshall Islands. So this is going to be a continuation of the discussion on nuclear testing. But this is also going to be a look at colonialism and the occupation of indigenous land. I noted in the last episode that there were specific nuclear tests that were performed by the United States military. And it is also important to note that there were other countries also participating in nuclear testing, and they were the Soviet Union, the USSR at the time, China, France, and some others. So as I'm talking about the U.S. military and giving them a hard time, I want you to know that they were not the only girls at the dance, okay? So we're going to start this off by talking about, actually, before we get there, before we start setting the scene, we're going to give some flowers. And the first person I want to give some flowers to is none other than at Dorelli the young man who gave us the Where the Money Reside song and anthem and hand movements, the claps, and the gesture for cash. This young genius, this young king has given us, I'm going to speak for myself. He has given me my anthem for 2021, okay? Because I, Rashida, am where the money reside, okay? So we're giving some flowers to him. Also, at the date that I am recording this, it's MLK Day. And I wasn't going to timestamp, but you know what? We're going to, because this is important. And we're actually going to not even talk about Martin Luther King from the context of I Have a Dream. I know everyone loves to try to quote him or use him as their human shield when they have been called out on their ridiculousness. But that's just not what we're doing, So we're going to give some flowers to MLK on this here day, on the day that we observe his birthday. And really, I would encourage folks to read his other speeches. I would actually encourage you to read the speech he gave about the ills, the ills of advancement in technology. It's one of the and actually I think they have it on Tidal. I think Tidal has like a lot of Dr. King's speeches, and I know they're available on YouTube as well. So I suggest, if you have not, I suggest you take the time to do that. Also, since we're here, I'm going to give some flowers to Malcolm X. If you guys follow me on Twitter, you saw that I finally watched One Night in Miami, and I was very moved. I didn't know that it was based on a stage play, but I could tell from the setup of the movie. I was like, this very much so reads like a stage play. And I was completely correct about that. It was based on a stage play, and it was very good. It was very compelling. The young man who played Malcolm X did an amazing job. And, knowing or have recently learned a lot more about Malcolm X and his life, especially at that time when he came to visit with Muhammad Ali in Miami, I know that he was, as the movie denoted, he was under a lot of strain and a lot of stress. And I could feel that. I could very much so feel that. I was very compelled by that. And by everyone's performance. I didn't know Jim Brown was such a bad mamma jamma. I should have known, because he looks like a very imposing person. So I'm in no way surprised that he was also not that person to fuck with. So I felt that. So I actually want to give flowers to Regina King. I'm a Regina King stan. I've been standing for her since Boys in the Hood. Like, I love her. And of course, I loved her in Watchmen. She was amazing. And this movie that she directed, One Night in Miami, is very, very good. So giving all the flowers to our ancestors, the folks who came before us, who saw this land in worse condition than probably what we think it is. The stakes are still high. Little De La Soul for y'all. Okay, that's the flowers. Let's get into the Marshall Islands. So, if you don't know where it is, the Marshall Islands are located in the Pacific Ocean, and they're kind of close to Australia and Papua New Guinea, but it's a series of other islands in this area as well, in addition to the Marshall Islands. And they are actually a part of the Federated States of Micronesia, which include the Mariana Islands, the Caroline Islands, and Kiribati. And altogether, the Marshall Islands is about 600 islands that includes 1,150 individual islands and islets, or islets. Islets. But that sounds like islets. Okay, anyway. All right, moving on. We have specifically as part of the Marshall Islands, we have the Bikini Atoll. And that contains 23 islands and a lagoon. And for those of you who are like, girl, what the hell is an atoll? All right, so an atoll, or a coral atoll, is a ring of coral reef with a lagoon, body of water, in the middle. And the lagoon can be partially enclosed by the actual atoll itself, or fully or completely enclosed. And the Marshall Islands themselves were quote unquote discovered by Spanish sailors in 1529. And from there, it has had a series of occupations from the Spanish, from Japan, and of course, the US of A. And it was actually occupied by the Japanese military, or taken possession of, in the 1920s. And going back to atolls very quickly, as I mentioned, they are formed by coral reef, but this is on top of submarine volcanic platforms, right? So these islands that are formed from atolls are often near lagoons, as I mentioned, and are made of coral sand and shell fragments. And if you're wondering why I'm harping on this, it's because this is part of the ecosystem of the ocean. It's part of the life cycle, where you have former organisms that their bodies, their shells are being repurposed, right? And of course, this doesn't take no little bit of time, right? It does not take a little bit of time to form an atoll on top of volcanic platforms, okay? So we've kind of set the scene. Let's talk about, let's come on in here and talk about some of these here tests and the timelines. So going back to nuclear testing very quickly, as I brought this up in the last episode. So nuclear testing can occur in one of three ways, or a series of three ways. Atmospheric, so in the air, underground, and underwater. And in the last episode, I mentioned that I was going to hold off on talking about underwater testing specifically for this episode. And continuing to set the scene, we had just come off the end of World War II. So World War II started in 1939 and it ended in September of 1945. And the testing that occurred, the nuclear testing that occurred on the Marshall Islands, occurred from 1946 to 1958. And there were 67 tests performed during that time. 43 of them occurred in the Iwataq Atoll, and the rest occurred at Bikini Atoll. The Pacific Proving Ground, the PPG, was established in 1947 in the Iwataq Atoll. And and I mentioned this organization in the previous episode, the Atomic Energy Commission, which was established after World War II. They were established through the Atomic Energy Act of 1946. And now that they are formed, they really wanted to find some space to do their testing. So November 6, 1946, President Truman proposed to the United Nations that the Marshall Islands be placed under a United Nations trusteeship, with America as the quote-unquote administering authority. That's important. And the point of this whole exercise, so the U.S. told the UN, was for the U.S. to help prepare the Marshall Islands for independence. It is important to note that the Marshall Islands did not get independence from this trusteeship until 1990. So Truman was actually opposed to continental testing. So the best options were going to be I might butcher this name, so bear with me, but it's the Kwajalein and the Iwutok, and those were the choices that they had. So the Atomic Energy Commission went with the Iwutok Atoll. And as I mentioned, this is where the bulk of the testing occurred. And this is also because, as far as the AEC was concerned, Bikini Atoll was too small. They needed the big guns. They needed that big drip, okay? And after the United States, quote unquote, liberated the Marshall Islands from Japan, because as I mentioned, Japan was just in there having fun with their feet up. So after, the U.S. supposedly liberated and told the Japanese to get on out, they proceeded to create several military bases there and across the Pacific, because as I mentioned, there are a series of islands in this particular area. January 29th, 1950, Truman approved the accelerated development of thermonuclear technology. And the Korean War actually started in the spring of 1951. And in 1953, the Pacific Proving Ground, the PPG, expanded to the Bikini Atoll Islands as well. So let's get into these tests. We have Operation Castle, and I mentioned this one in the last episode. So here it is, March 1st, 1954. So Operation Castle Bravo. So as I mentioned in the last episode, this is how they have these operations with a series of separate tests underneath them, and they are all individually named. So this one in particular that I'm talking about is the Bravo test. And this was performed at the Bikini Atoll. And let's just get straight to it. So it just basically irradiated like 200 plus people on the Rongelap and the Utrok, U-T-R-O-K, Utrok, the Utrok Atoll. So the Bravo test was the largest U.S. nuclear test in history. The Castle series was supposed to be to demonstrate how the Pacific Islands are, basically how important they are into the U.S. in terms of national security. Because keep in mind now, these islands and where they are situated, they're not too far from Japan. It's not far from Japan. I mentioned that it's close to New Guinea, which it is, and also Australia. So it's in this area that is very pivotal. And you also have to keep in mind too, that we had just come off of World War II, as I mentioned. There's a mass amount of pressure to accelerate, and get our hands on nuclear arms. So it is also the best way to do that is to find a good position for you to bomb the Jesus out of your enemies. Okay? So the nuclear testing that occurred, as I mentioned, basically caused massive amounts of harm to the indigenous folks living in those atolls. And the radioactive fallout arrived within hours because the scientists working on these nuclear tests did not account for the fact that there could be shifts or changes in weather, which there were at the time. And a lot of people had to be evacuated, and there was 7,000 square miles of damage as a result of this test in the Pacific. That's Operation Castle. The U.S. Navy conducted two, and I'm about to gag, but they conducted two Operation Crossroads. Oh, gasp! Operation Crossroads. So this is another one, and there were two major tests under this one that are significant that I will note. And these were actually performed in the lagoon, and this is important as well, in the Bikini Atoll. And Operation Crossroads, oh my God, the point of this test was to test the effectiveness of explosions on target ships. Important. So we have Able, the test, and Operation, and the test, another test called Baker. So Able was detonated in the air, and it was about 500 feet above the intended target, and the distance, it was completely off. The distance was off by 1,500 feet. So this is, imagine just a bomb that is supposed to be being dropped. It is not. There are certain things that were not accounted for, and caused a lot of damage. And we have we have the Baker test, and Baker was a bomb that was exploded under the water, and the explosion formed a massive column of water that actually took out nearby aircraft carriers and battleships. So it was a mess. It was a lot bigger than what they intended. And let's move on to another test called Operation Sandstone. And this is a nuclear test series that occurred in 1948. And it was conducted completely away from the public because obviously, Operation Castle was there was a lot of public attention around this particular test. And also keep in mind, this is also a one of the series of other tests occurring in the U.S. around the same time. So some of these, they wanted to have it publicly. But obviously with the fallout, it was becoming a little bit more kind of touch and go to be so public about this. So Operation Sandstone occurred completely out away from the public view. And this was actually conducted in the Phyto Atoll. And this test included the placement of bombs on 200-foot towers on separate atoll islands. And there's a specific test, the zebra test, with the radioactive contamination was detected 400 miles away. And there was a rainstorm that occurred after this test was performed, and the nuclear cloud mixed with the surface moisture and spread and caused fallout farther away from where the test actually occurred. And just for context, and I mentioned this, that the term fallout had a couple transitions. It wasn't how it was defined, was not how it later became to be defined. So the term fallout was used for a nuclear cloud drifting upwards. And later this was changed, of course, and this was not the correct term, but this was fallout. This was atmospheric fallout, because fallout is the time that it takes for any type of contaminant in the atmosphere to reach the land, right? That's fallout. And in the previous episode, I talked about the specific radionuclides or the radioactive isotopes that you will find in these types of tests, these types of bombs. And that was cesium-137 with her badass, who just, is out here just giving the children all the cancer it possibly can. And it was also iodine-131, just all in the place. And in addition to the fact that this is just, obviously, this is radiated and it radiated people, just giving the girls all the radiation humanly possible, another major impact is displacement. And what's important to note about displacement, and I think this is also part of a larger discussion when we can talk about displacement based upon human interference, but displacement causes social and psychological side effects. And part of that comes from being severed, folks being separated from what they know and from what is familiar. And the bombs detonated during Operation Crossroads and Sandstone were stronger, or for those of you all who are scientifically inclined, they had a greater force than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I think. I'm gonna Google it. Anywho, the bomb dropped at Hiroshima had 15 kilotons of force. And the bombs that were detonated in these two tests, Crossroads and Sandstone, had more force than that. Think about that. And think about the aftermath of that. The people of the Bikini Atoll had to be evacuated due to the radiation that was caused by Operation Crossroads. And the Bikinians, were accustomed to fishing in their lagoon. That's what they were used to. And when they were evacuated and moved further south, they couldn't do that. So they couldn't rely on the skills that they had developed over time. They could not rely on those things to sustain themselves any longer. And this is part of what I'm talking about when I talk about displacement and the separation folks have from their homelands. And the Iwataq people were moved also, and they were moved so that Operation Sandstone could be conducted. And let's fast forward a little bit. So in 1968, then President Lyndon B. Johnson told the people of the Bikini Atoll that they could go back home. The Iwataq people were told the same thing because, the U.S. had finally was like, oh, I guess we didn't mess up. And they did a cleanup, a little bit of a cleanup operation on the Bikini Atoll. And, some folks actually did return around 1972. But due to the high levels of radiation, they had to leave again around 1977 for the Kili Island. In 1980, or the 1980s, the people of the Eniwetok, Bikini, Rongelap, and the Utrak atolls and other Marshall Islanders decided to form like Voltron and sue the bejesus out of the U.S. to the sum and to the high key of $5 billion. In April, fast forwarding once again, April of 2014, the Marshall Islands accused China, South Korea, France, India, Israel, Pakistan, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the U.S. of not ceasing the nuclear arms race and pursued legal action in the International Court of Justice. That's a real thing. Look it on up. The only problem is the International Court of Justice did not have the jurisdiction to try this case. But a lot of the information that is available, and there is a lot of information, and I definitely recommend, I have all the resources as I usually do. I definitely recommend that you do some research on this for yourself. But a lot of this is not comprehensive. It is not readily available to mean that it's not readily available from a technical standpoint. You do have to do some digging. You can see the pictures of a lot of these tests, and I definitely encourage folks to take a look at it so you can see like exactly what people were being told is totally cool for them to come sit up and pull up a chair and watch the mushroom cloud. But I wanted to highlight in this timeline the important times that the folks of the Marshall Islands were like, you've got us messed up, okay? And so now I think we have more than come to the crossroads. And now you all know that there are some not so amazing crossroads either. So in part one, we took a look at the impact of the nuclear testing in the U.S., specifically on the Nevada Proving Ground. And again, like I mentioned, that the U.S. was not the only country that was involved in nuclear testing. And the Pacific Islands, as they stand, but also the Marshall Islands, were invaded and controlled solely for larger European and Asian countries to have military advantages and vantage points over their enemies, and for the testing of nuclear power. And the primary result of that was radiation poisoning. Atmospheric nuclear testing occurred and continued in the U.S. until 1961. Underground and underwater testing continued beyond that point. The Marshall Islands were not the only Pacific islands that were involved in nuclear testing. And again, the Soviet Union and the UK were also involved, and France and other countries as well. Actually, for example, France conducted 17 atomic tests in the 1960s in Algeria, which is in Africa. And going back very quickly, the US and the Soviet Union and the UK did agree to stop atmospheric nuclear testing in 1958. But France didn't sign that. And this treaty I'm referring to is the Partial Test Ban Treaty. And also, the military occupation of the Pacific Islands did not stop after that Partial Test Ban Treaty was signed. And getting into the atolls, as I mentioned. And atolls are actually very heavily impacted by global ice ages and can either completely dry out or be completely engulfed by water. And the weather concerns generally into this area are drought in the northern islands and typhoons in the summer and the fall, and tsunamis that are caused by volcanic eruptions and by earthquakes. And getting into a little bit more of our modern history that we're seeing, what we just saw this summer, I don't know if y'all remember, but we ran out of named storms and we had to shift to the Greek alphabet. So we're having more hurricanes and they are more powerful and more devastating. And getting into this a little bit deeper, we have to talk about the impact, the global impact of islands and coastal cities around the world that are having to really switch it up in response to climate change, as a result of melting land ice, which is causing the sea levels to rise. And if you're wondering kind of why that is, very quickly and very high level, think about when you wear a lot of clothes or you wear those reflecty suits when you go work out, you start to sweat, right? Okay, that's melting land ice. The planet is sweating because it's too warm. We're not able to release enough of the heat. So what can we do? And what are some of these Pacific islands, as I mentioned, like the Marshall Islands and other coastal cities and island cities? What are they doing? Well, the United Nations has designated 38 island countries as small island developing states, or SIDS. And this includes the Marshall Islands and some other nations that you may be familiar with, such as the Bahamas, Barbados, Belize, and the Maldives. In addition to having to develop more sustainable practices, these nations also are trying to develop resiliency as well. For example, in Papua New Guinea, activists are planting mangrove trees on the coast, and these encourage fish and other wildlife to form habitat, and it also is a helpful means to protect the coast. In Jamaica, they're harvesting rainwater. And these SIDS, these countries, these developing nations, also have a great and excellent website with toolkits, resources, case studies, and other information to help build their platforms and provide other information to countries who want to develop their own sustainable practices. And since this is a global issue, other coastal cities around the world are in the process or have already developed sustainable plans and sustainability plans for these changes that we're seeing and experiencing. And so I would encourage you to check out some of the just transition work that occurred after Hurricane Sandy, which was a very devastating storm that devastated the Northeast. I would definitely recommend checking that out. And, another area that, we talked about in the previous episode was Phyto Remediation. And that's the absorption of heavy metals by plants that are then released as less harmful byproducts because of transpiration, which is part of the water cycle. And going back to mangrove trees, this is why this is a benefit to plant these, because in addition to being a home for fish, they also, they create, as I mentioned, a natural ecosystem. And mangrove trees absorb a lot of carbon. And as you know, we have an excess of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So when we talk about climate change, we're really talking about the greenhouse gas effect, because we have entirely too much methane, CH4, carbon dioxide, and chlorofluorocarbons in the lower atmosphere, right? So that's why we're seeing these changes in the weather. That's what climate change is. That's what it's a result of. So I would definitely encourage folks to take a look at some just transition work, as I mentioned, for Hurricane Sandy. I would definitely recommend visiting the SIDS website and seeing what folks are doing around the world. And I would also, taking and when we're talking about what can we do, I would also take a page from what the folk at the Marshall Islands did. They sued just the same way folks at Lovecraft, you hear me? Love Canal in New York, the way that they sued. And there is nothing wrong with using the law and bringing public exploitation, in the specific case of the Marshall Island, the people of the Marshall Islands, to the exploitation of indigenous people. And I would also like to really begin to shift and have a conversation about, like, how do we prevent this shit from happening in the first place? Okay, how do we prevent this stuff from happening at all? And, now that I've had a chance, very little, to kind of calm down, just a smidget, after the whole recent things that have gone on in this January, so fresh and so new into this new year, the reason that, I talk a lot about history on this show is really because if you don't take the time to learn your history and remember, you're bound to repeat it again. And, when I'm talking about, and going back to part one, just one more time, I mentioned the term state-sponsored violence, and seeing giant mushroom clouds in the air and being told that it's okay, or having people quietly evacuated, or having these tests occurring away from the public view, is state-sponsored violence. Folks being shot and unable to walk and then not having any charges brought, that's state-sponsored violence. So, I would like to be able, of course, to have a talk about how we prevent these things in the future. And going back to just very quickly what I said about, white allyship. And I'm just going to be frank. I'm never going to take my foot off anybody's neck, period. I'm not going to do that. That's not who I am, and that's not how I get down. If you do something I don't like, you will very much so hear it from me. And I may or may not, I'm gonna let you know. So going back to that just very, very briefly, I just want to say, if this is a time for you, if you think that being online and like tweeting how you feel, because I see I've seen a lot of Twitter fingers, and it's not all bad, it's not all negative. It's definitely folks who are, calling people out on their stuff and saying it like it is. And I appreciate that. But I would actually say, now that I've had a little more time to be calm, I would say that you need to do a little bit more than that. So just really quick to quote someone that I admire very much, Miss Sanaya Azadine Alaya. She says, you can get me up, but you have to keep me up. And what I mean by that is, that's fine. I appreciate seeing the angry tweets, and I appreciate, some of the things that I'm seeing, but you need to keep that up. And not only do you need to keep that up, you have to be willing and able, especially for those of you who choose to be active in however you choose to be active. You also need to, much like in other areas, you need to learn when to step aside. And you need to learn when it's time to promote the younger voices, the more marginalized voices. But you can also see that we will also do it ourselves. See, the folks in the Marshall Islands, they didn't wait around. They didn't play around. What happened to them in Operation Castle, Operation Crossroads, Operation Sandstone, they didn't forget about that. They didn't just say, oh, it's totally cool. They're suing the shit out of the U.S. And they've done it multiple times. And they brought the U.S. up on charges. And rightfully so. And so I would say, regardless, once again, white allies, regardless to what you choose to do, understand, like I said, my point still stands, very much so still stands, that people are coming. So you can either choose to help out or be a hindrance. And I really hope, because we've had enough hindrance, we've had enough delays. I've heard that folk are just out here buying the guns and such, It doesn't help that I foolishly started watching that damn Night Stalker. Oh my God, I have to stop myself. Woo! Because I damn sure checked the doors like 3 times to make sure they were all locked, okay? That I was in here and I was secure. But just to say that, I encourage folks who consider themselves to be allies, that I would really ask you to do some inner searching on what that really means. Because I can tell you, as someone who has been out here, has been the boots on the ground, I know what folks tell me they are doing to show up, and then I know how they actually show up. And I would tell you that there is a disconnect. And I would encourage you, the whites, to get clear on that. And people of color too, I would also encourage you to not be afraid to lean on each other. And because you know what's best, you know what your community needs better than anybody else. So do not feel that you are not qualified or capable to stand up or make a note. In fact, there is someone else that I want to give some flowers to. He is a young man who's running for office in New Orleans. Let me see if I can find him really quickly. I can't find his name, but there was a young man, and I apologize. I cannot believe I cannot find this guy's name, but he was a young man in New Orleans. He had a clip that went viral, and he is going to be running for office. I don't know yet. I have to look to see if I started following him, and I cannot believe I'm blanking on his name. But hopefully between the time that I put this episode out, I will find it so I can tag him. But shout out to him. And that young lady, that queen who sat in front of that entire, I think it was probably a commission hearing, and read everybody. Like, you have to be a disruptor, and don't be afraid. And there are ways to do it peacefully. What we are seeing is just a giant temper tantrum. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm actually talking about doing things with intention, because you can do things, right? But you need to do, if you want to see them become fruitful, you need to do them with intention, right? So that's what I'm encouraging folks to do. That's why I wanted to talk about the Marshall Islands. I did not realize that it was going to become such a discussion about colonialism, but I'm very glad to bring that into the conversation, because that's the reality, that what people did was the occupation of land that did not belong to them, and the exploitation and disrespect of it, which has had global impacts. Okay, so marinate on all this, marinate on all the things that I've said, and quickly, just a couple quick shout outs before I roll up out of here. First is to Glitz and Gems. My good girlfriend is doing it with the glitz and the gems. She's been a sponsor of this show several times, and also cool enough to do the Busset Challenge, which you will never catch me doing. Not these knees. Nope. And also to Lorena Russell, whose essay I have referenced in part 1 of this episode, and here again I have also referenced it. It is her essay can be found in the book called The Philosophy of Horror, which is a collection of essays about puppies, obviously, that was edited by Thomas Fahey, which I may have jacked up that last name, but it's Thomas, and it's Fahy. So again, do your research, get out and get active. Thank you for joining me, and I will see you again at the Crossroads.